I just happen to come up hard. I just come from the poet's part. Legal or illegal, baby, I gotta make it bright like city life. I gotta make it. This is a big rich town.
Fake love, I don't need it, you can keep it, that's a fact. I had to make up my mind. I took that weight on my shoulders. I done been down.
So now, y'all, we can finally hop back into the Kardashians, you guys, and what they are actually doing with Diddy, or what they were doing with Diddy, and what they were allegedly using their ties to Diddy in order to find prominent people in the industry that they could allegedly use to blackmail for various amounts of money and perks in the industry, you guys, in order to remain relevant and in control of their finances. And how Diddy helped them sabotage Britney Spears allegedly to steal $600 million from her. So before I get to explaining to you guys who Taylor is, I wanted to show you guys this movie that I watched a long time ago. It's called I Care a Lot. It is about this lady who works for the court, and she's basically appointed as legal guardian by the court over all of these old people who don't have family members, or people don't care about them enough to check in on them or care about them. Is when the court sends someone to take care of these old people because they don't have anyone else. And this person takes advantage of these old people, and she preys on the people who don't have a lot of family with a lot of money or resources. And so once she feels like she's found the perfect person who fits within her description to take advantage of, she'll basically torment this old person. She'll take over their lives. She'll take over their finances. She'll sell all their belongings. And then she'll lock the old person in a nursing home while she continues destroying their life. And then if they don't do what she wants them to do, she'll put them on medication. She'll take their privileges away. She's in cahoots with the retirement home where she placed the old person, so she'll have the retirement home staff mistreating the person while she's out living her best life off of their money that she took from them. So basically, she sets her claws into this one old lady who lives by herself and has a bank full of cash, and nobody cares for her, and she thinks that the lady doesn't have anybody. So she kidnaps the lady through the courts, puts her in a nursing home. So then the lady's son finds out that this lady has done everything to his mom, and he goes after the lady. He tries to unalive the caretaker because she will not release his mother out of this retirement home. And since she is now the legal guardian and his mother is technically a ward of the state, he can do nothing about it. And so instead he goes in business with her, because come to find out, he's the head of the mob or the cartel or whatever. So he has all this money to invest in this lady for her to open various agencies around the country that do the same thing that she was doing to his mother. And they were really changing the game, you guys, until someone from this lady's past, whose mother she mistreated, came back and unalived her, y'all. And so if y'all haven't watched this movie, take the time out today and go and watch it, because it will really open your eyes to how a lot of people are in the industry, and how it really is legal for people just like this lady to go out and make other people like Britney Spears seem like they're crazy and their mental health is off, to the point where she will trick you into a conservatorship, y'all, so she can take advantage of your estate and do what she will with it. Louise Mary Taylor is an American businesswoman and entrepreneur. Taylor became a public figure in January 2008, acting as a singer Britney Spears' family spokesperson amid Dr. Phil's alleged violation of trust in a family intervention.
Back in 2004, Lou was working with Spears' younger sister as her business manager, and she eventually ended up getting cozy with her father, Jamie, as well. From then on, she was the family's spokesperson.
In early 2008, a small-time Tennessee company with big-time aspirations made a loan to Britney Spears' father, who for years had struggled financially. Less than a month later, after consulting with the owner of the company, TriStar Sports and Entertainment Group, James P. Spears had his daughter placed into a conservatorship, a legal arrangement typically reserved for people unable to care for themselves or work. He would wield vast power over her life and finances. Mr. Spears soon sent his daughter on a 97-show international tour, and he hired TriStar, to whom he still owed at least $40,000, to manage Miss Spears' business. Over the ensuing decade, the assignment would generate millions of dollars for TriStar and help transform it and its owner, Louise M. Taylor, into one of the premier managers in entertainment with clients including the Kardashians. Today, Mrs. Taylor, a deeply religious former bookkeeper who had few notable clients before Mrs. Spears, faces questions from Mrs. Spears' lawyers and others about how much money she made as the pop star's business manager and whether she improperly enriched herself. The conservatorship, which a California judge ended last month, was intended to protect Mrs. Spears from financial exploitation. But Mrs. Spears has said that she felt at times that she was coerced to work, and the more she did, the more money she generated, and the more flowed to the lawyers, managers, agents, and other gatekeepers who surrounded the singer, thanks in part to a variety of unusual financial arrangements. Britney Spears' father, Jamie Spears, received a loan of at least $40,000 from TriStar just a few weeks before Britney was involuntarily placed into a conservatorship. The New York Times reports in their dangling new expose on Lou Taylor. Below are some of the most noteworthy items. Britney embarked on a 97-show international circus tour the same year she was placed in the conservatorship. TriStar was hired to oversee her finances, to whom Jamie owed the $40,000 to. It is believed Jamie Spears collected $6 million of Britney's money over the course of the conservatorship. 2 years into the conservatorship, the hashtag Britney Spears Foundation was shut down. Tax records showed that one of its final payouts was $42,000 to Taylor's Mercy Ministries, a Tennessee-based Christian group that works with young women with depression, unplanned pregnancies, and other issues. It is also allegedly tried to convert lesbian women to being heterosexual. In 2010, tens of thousands of dollars from Britney's foundation went to a Christian counseling group with ties to Mrs. Taylor and her husband. Jamie at times donated 10% of that income to a church run by the Taylors. Taylor had Britney's estate pay for ads in Hollywood trade publications praising Mrs. Taylor and TriStar. Accompanying one of the articles was an ad quoting Britney, "So proud to be working with the best of the best." Another ad appeared in 2019 issue of the Hollywood Reporter that featured Mrs. Taylor on the cover as the business manager icon. TriStar will receive 5% of Britney's adjusted gross entertainment revenue, and Lou Taylor's attorney declined to explain what that meant. When Britney canceled Domination, TriStar stood to lose their 5% cut. Taylor asked Jamie to approve a fee of $500,000, and he approved it despite Britney not working. In June of 2019, a law firm representing Lou Taylor sent a hashtag Free Britney supporter a cease and desist. The law firm billed Britney's estate $350,000, which included costs related to Mrs. Taylor's legal action. Black Box Security also kept tabs on Free Britney fans who criticized Mrs. Taylor and the conservatorship, and the surveillance was billed to Britney's estate. Jamie's lawyer sent 8 cease and desist letters to the Times. Many TriStar employees told the Times they wouldn't talk because they were scared of being sued. Near the center of it all was Mrs. Taylor. According to a New York Times investigation based on court filings, financial records, company documents, and interviews with more than 70 people familiar with the conservatorship, Mrs. Taylor or her businesses. Not long after the conservatorship commenced, accounts for Mrs. Spears were opened at an obscure Tennessee firm, Stonebridge Wealth Management, that Mrs. Taylor co-founded and co-owned. While the firm said it did not receive fees for many services it provided, several other maneuvers appeared to benefit Mrs. Taylor. When a security company hired by Mr. Spears surveilled Free Britney protesters who criticized Mrs. Taylor, Mrs. Spears' estate paid. According to a former employee at the security company, the estate also paid some of Ms. Taylor's personal legal fees, leading Mrs. Spears' lawyers to complain to a California court. In 2010, tens of thousands of dollars from Mrs. Spears' charitable foundation went to a Christian counseling group with ties to Mrs. Taylor and her husband, and whose founder once boasted that the group helped people abandon lesbianism, and Mrs. Spears has been an icon to the LGBTQ community. Mr. Spears, who collected millions of dollars from his daughter as her conservator, also at times donated 10% of that income to a church run by the Taylors, according to a financial document revealed review by The Times. And Britney Spears' estate paid for ads in Hollywood trade publications praising Miss Taylor and TriStar. It isn't clear if Mrs. Spears knew how her money was spent, and her lawyer is investigating whether Mrs. Spears, Mrs. Taylor, and others unfairly profited from what Mrs. Spears viewed as her wrongful captivity. They should be in jail, Miss Spears said in court in June. A lawyer for Mr. Spears said that Jamie's administration of Britney's estate was always consistent with Britney's best interest. He said the court, a co-conservator of Mrs. Spears' court-appointed lawyer, approved of Mr. Spears' decisions. He added, Jamie has nothing to hide and will therefore hide nothing. Charles Harder, a lawyer for Mrs. Taylor, said TriStar faithfully served the estate and helped Mrs. Spears build an estimated $60 million fortune that is a success by any standard. And Matthew White, a lawyer for Stonebridge, defended the firm's work, saying in a recent letter to Mrs. Spears' legal team that it worked diligently and tirelessly to provide valuable services to benefit the estate, often for no fee. In the United States, there are an estimated 1.3 million conservatorships, also known as guardianships. Conservators are granted broad powers over a vulnerable person's life and are required to act in their best interests. Under California judicial rules, the conservator must avoid any personal, business, or professional interest or relationship that is or reasonably could be perceived as being self-serving or adverse to the best interest of the conservatee. Mr. Spears' case highlights how that doesn't always happen and comes amid growing calls to reform a system that can victimize rather than protect. A conservatorship should be a last resort, her lawyer Matthew Rosengart told a court in August. It should not be a tool for the enrichment of third parties. Miss Taylor grew up in upstate New York. She played for the high school volleyball team and spent a semester at Monroe Community College but didn't graduate. Mr. Harder noted that Bill Gates and Steve Jobs also didn't graduate from college. In her early 20s, Lou Taylor got a job as a bookkeeper at a health insurance company in Rochester, New York. Rob Taylor, her husband, worked as a draftsman in the same building. The pair met at a blood drive and got married in 1989 on their 21-foot boat named Perfect. The bride and groom wore white bathing suits. The couple moved to Florida the next year, and Mrs. Taylor joined a management firm that represented entertainers. In 1993, she started TriStar Accounting Group to serve similar clients. Some of Miss Taylor's early customers were amateur athletes who went pro. She also started representing the model Nikki Taylor in the face of many teen magazines in the 1990s. In 2000, Miss Lou Taylor sold the business to the accounting firm Gilman, and Gilman executives soon suspected that Mrs. Taylor was hiding money owed to the company. According to Michael Ryan, a top executive at the time, and another person familiar with what happened, a locksmith changed the locks at TriStar's offices to prevent employees from entering. As an armed security guard stood watch, Gilman's lawyer searched Lou Taylor's files. According to Mr. Ryan and the other person familiar with the matter, she ultimately agreed to pay the money in question. Mr. Harder, the lawyer for Mrs. Taylor, says she had temporarily placed funds in a separate bank account because Gilman wasn't paying bills that it was supposed to. He said TriStar was open about everything and did nothing wrong. There was no lawsuit or official record of the accusations, and the two companies agreed to separate in July 2001, and Miss Taylor could start anew. By late 2001, the Taylors had arrived in Brentwood, Tennessee, and Mr. Taylor started a chapter of Calvary Chapel, an independent network of churches. He was the pastor, and she was the ladies' ministry leader and joined the board. Miss Taylor also incorporated TriStar Sports and Entertainment Group. I wanted to create a business management firm that would service athletes and artists and make a difference by upholding morality and integrity, she later said on a podcast. In 2002, Miss Taylor co-founded Stonebridge. Her business partner was Mitchell S. Martin, who had been chief financial officer for the Televangelist Inspirational Network and a finance manager at Motorola. Stonebridge was tiny. It only had a few employees, and until 2006 managed less than $10 million. Entertainment business managers in Stonebridge seemed an unlikely candidate to advise high-wattage stars. Before long, though, the upstart firm would land one of the world's biggest celebrities. Mrs. Spears rocketed to fame in 1998 with the release of her single Baby One More Time at age 16. She became a pop culture sensation. Her success opened doors for her younger sister Jamie Lynn Spears, who in 2005 starred in a Nickelodeon series, Zoe 101, and became a TriStar client. That year, she turned 14 years old. Mrs. Spears would also become a TriStar client. The details of how he and Mrs. Taylor met aren't clear. Britney Spears began publicly struggling shortly after giving birth to her second son in 2006. She filed for divorce from her children's father, Kevin Federline. A battle ensued, and Mrs. Spears eventually lost custody of her sons. In January 2008, she was twice hospitalized on involuntary psychiatric holds. Her father, who had filed for bankruptcy, struggled with alcoholism and faced accusations of physical and verbal abuse, had largely been absent from his daughter's life, and now he had re-entered. Around the time his daughter was hospitalized and while he was working as a cook, Mr. Spears received a loan of at least $40,000 from TriStar. His lawyer, Mr. Weingarten, initially told the Times that Mr. Spears never received a loan from TriStar, but later confirmed its existence. TriStar routinely loans money to clients, he said. On February 1st, after discussing the matter with Mrs. Taylor, Mr. Spears petitioned a California court for conservatorship powers, court records show. Mr. Harder said Mrs. Taylor did not push for the creation of the conservatorship. His lawyers argued that Mrs. Spears was unable to care for herself and was vulnerable to exploitation. The judge approved Mr. Spears' request, and she granted Mr. Spears and a lawyer the power to enter into contracts for Mrs. Spears, run her businesses, and invest her money. Ms. Spears initially got an allowance of $1,500 a week, and the amount increased in subsequent years. Mr. Spears would collect an estimated $6 million over the course of the conservatorship. The existence of the TriStar loan, which hasn't previously been reported, is troubling. Since Anthony, the incoming president of the National Guardianship Association, which represents conservators, it makes me wonder where the allegiance lies. Who is also the chief guardianship investigator for the county clerk in Palm Beach County, Florida? Is the conservator making decisions in the best interest of the conservatee or the business manager who they owe a debt to? He added. It reeks of conflict of interest. Mr. Harder said in an email, a small loan later repaid had no effect on TriStar's work for the estate in later years. Under California law, conservatorships are reserved for people who cannot feed, clothe, or shelter themselves. Only months after arguing that his daughter was incapacitated and therefore needed to be under his control, Mr. Spears committed her to an 8-month tour named Circus. TriStar was hired to serve as the tour's business manager, handling its finances and accounting. The tour grossed an estimated $130 million. By December 2009, TriStar was finalizing a contract to become the manager not just for the tour, but also for Mrs. Spears' estate. The estate includes many but not all of Mrs. Spears' assets and the firm's responsibilities, including paying bills and cash management. TriStar would receive 5% of Mrs. Spears' adjusted gross entertainment revenue, according to Mr. Harder, who declined to explain what that meant. Around that time, Stonebridge began providing the conservatorship with financial advice regarding 3 accounts held at another firm. Ms. Taylor at the time owned half of Stonebridge, which shared offices with TriStar in Tennessee, according to securities filings obtained via a public records request. In a recent letter to Mrs. Spears' legal team, Stonebridge said it provided the advisory services without receiving any fees or compensation whatsoever. Court documents, however, list about $300 in advisory fees that the estate paid to Stonebridge in early 2012. Mr. White said that those fees were for discrete administrative work requested by Mr. Spears, but he wouldn't elaborate. The question is whether Stonebridge was selected because it was the best suited to serve Mrs. Spears or because Mrs. Taylor had a stake in the company, since Michael, a forensic accountant and certified fraud examiner. Mr. Harder said TriStar featured Stonebridge on a list of recommended financial advisors, but that it was up to clients to choose. Stonebridge is on the list because it is a boutique that provides high-level services, he said. He added that Mrs. Taylor's practice was to disclose her ownership stake in Stonebridge. Mr. White said that the relationship between Stonebridge and TriStar has been accurately disclosed. Ms. Taylor sold her stake in Stonebridge in 2013, but the terms weren't disclosed. And since then, Mr. White said Mrs. Taylor has had no role in the management or operations of Stonebridge. The deal included a provision in which Mrs. Taylor would refer clients to Stonebridge, though she could also point them to other investment advisors, Mr. Harder said. As of 2016, TriStar and Stonebridge shared clients like the country music stars Martina McBride, Brian Kelly, and Tyler Hubbard, who each had millions of dollars. At Stonebridge, according to another Stonebridge client roster, in April of 2020, Stonebridge entered into a paid consulting agreement with Mr. Spears in his capacity as conservator. 3 months later, a lawyer for Mr. Spears told the court that he was considering consolidating his daughter's money in one place. Mrs. Wiles said that Mr. Spears had been vetting Stonebridge as an investment advisor for 13 years. Around the same time, Jamie Lynn Spears petitioned the court to move funds in her sister's trust to an account advised by Stonebridge. Jamie Lynn Spears later withdrew the petition. Her lawyer, George Short, said that there was no story here but wouldn't elaborate. Britney Spears' lawyers at the time, Samuel Ingham, had earlier expressed concerns about ties between TriStar and Stonebridge, according to a court filing. In response, Mrs. Wild wrote that Stonebridge was independent from and not affiliated with TriStar. The filing didn't mention that Mrs. Taylor co-founded and previously owned half of Stonebridge. Two former senior TriStar executives said that the firm's finances were kept under such tight wraps that they lacked access to basic information like the company's balance sheets and income statements. One of the most secretive accounts at TriStar belonged to Britney Spears. Every year, bookkeepers at TriStar conducted a lengthy court-mandated accounting of her estate. The resulting documents were both extremely specific and extremely vague. They listed some of the performers' expenses in minute detail: $4.98 at Walmart, $8.08 at Mrs. Fields' cookie shop. Yet the conservatorship has acknowledged it wasn't providing a complete description of all the estate's transactions, and it would be impractical to fit the business activities and transactions into the form of the traditional accounting. The conservatorship disclosed in numerous court-approved reports. In the public versions of the court documents, which are heavily redacted, do not show how much money TriStar received from the estate. In July, Mrs. Spears for the first time was allowed to choose her own lawyer, and she hired Mr. Rosengart, a former federal prosecutor. Mr. Rosengart has requested information and documents from Mr. Spears and TriStar that could clarify where Mrs. Spears' money went and how Britney Spears' father, Mr. Spears, used a network of companies and other entities to operate the estate. Britney Spears' attorney, Mr. Rosengart, has repeatedly asked TriStar a question: how much money did the firm make? TriStar has refused to provide the number. TriStar is effectively telling Britney that she should have to pay her lawyers to comb through hundreds of pages of complex, disjointed, and incomplete accountings, Mr. Rosengart said in an email to the Times. Mr. Harder said TriStar's compensation was disclosed in court filings that Mr. Rosengart has. Mr. Rosengart is not being forthcoming if he claims that he does not know the amounts that TriStar has been paid to date, Mr. Harder said. Mr. Spears and the Taylors are close. In 2017, Mr. Taylor baptized Mr. Spears and Mrs. Taylor in the Jordan River in Israel. Mr. Spears at times gave 10% of his conservatorship income to the Taylors' Calvary Chapel, Brentwood, a practice known as tithing. According to a 2010 financial document, Mr. Spears gave tens of thousands of dollars in one-year loan to the church, which is about 500 miles away from where he lives in Louisiana. How Jamie spends his personal funds is not a matter of public interest, his lawyer said. It was not the only money that originated with Mrs. Spears that went to religious causes linked to the Taylors. Before the conservatorship began, Mrs. Spears created the Britney Spears Foundation. Its main reason was to support a children's arts camp. 2 years into the conservatorship, the foundation was shut down. Tax records show that one of its final payouts was $42,000 to Mercy Ministries, a Tennessee-based Christian group that works with young women with depression, unplanned pregnancies, and other issues. The Taylors have donated money to Mercy, and Mercy has donated to Calvary. Mercy's website at one point thanked the Taylors for consistently pouring your time and energy into the group. While Mrs. Spears has been a vocal supporter of the LGBTQ community, Mercy has not. In her 2013 book, Mercy's founder Nancy Alcorn said, Mercy helped people who previously identified as lesbians to adopt what she called a healthy and biblically based sexuality, and she said being gay was a product of sexual confusion. Mercy's chief executive said the group's thinking has evolved. Nina, the former director of the Spears Foundation, said that she was surprised to learn of its contribution to Mercy. She said that Mrs. Spears had wanted the foundation to stay away from religious causes, and I would not have advised that they receive funding, she said. The lawyer for Britney Spears' father has said that Mrs. Spears supported making this donation, and since the conservatorship began, Mrs. Spears has gone on 2 international tours, released 4 albums, and been a judge on the reality show The X Factor. In 2016, in the midst of a blockbuster 4-year residency at a Las Vegas casino, Ms. Spears told a court-appointed investigator that she wanted the conservatorship to end. She is sick of being taken advantage of, and she said that she is the one working and earning her money, but everyone around her is on her payroll, the investigator wrote. The following year, Variety profiled Mrs. Taylor, whose clients included Steven Tyler of Aerosmith, Gwen Stefani, and Jennifer Lopez. According to the article, was an ad quoting Mrs. Spears, so proud to be working with the best of the best. Another ad appeared in a 2019 issue of The Hollywood Reporter that featured Mrs. Taylor on the cover as business manager icon. Mr. Harder said that buying ads is a common way for entertainers to thank their representatives, and that TriStar was under the impression Mrs. Spears has signed off. TriStar's work for the estate had expanded beyond the traditional role of a business manager. For example, a TriStar executive, Robin Greenhill, controlled Mrs. Spears' credit card and administered her medications, according to a court investigator's report. In 2019, the conservatorship lurched into crisis. In January, Mrs. Spears canceled a second planned Las Vegas residency and announced an indefinite work hiatus. Mr. Spears then entered a mental health treatment facility in what she said was an involuntary confinement. The cancellation was costly for TriStar, which stood to collect 5% of the revenue. Court documents show that Mrs. Taylor then asked Mr. Spears to change the structure of TriStar's compensation so that the firm would automatically receive at least $500,000 a year. Mr. Spears approved, drawing protests from Mrs. Spears' lawyer at the time. Mr. Spears' confinement turbocharged the Free Britney movement, and the vocal group of fans questioned whether Mrs. Spears was in the conservatorship against her will. They accused Mrs. Taylor of exploiting the singer. In June of 2019, the law firm Sidley Austin sent a cease and desist letter on Mrs. Taylor's behalf to a Free Britney supporter whose website she claimed was defamatory. The law firm billed Mrs. Spears' estate $350,000, which included costs related to Mrs. Taylor's legal action. Mr. Ingham, who was Mr. Spears' lawyer at the time, said in a court filing that the payments were probably an impermissible gift of the conservatives' funds to Mrs. Taylor, and called for an independent review of all legal fees billed to the estate. Mrs. Spears' estate also paid for black box security, which monitored her phone and secretly recorded her in her bedroom, according to Alex Vlasov, a former black box employee and whistleblower. Screenshots of Mrs. Spears' text communications were shared with Mrs. Greenhill, Robin Greenhill, the TriStar executive. Black Box also kept tabs on Free Britney fans who criticized Mrs. Taylor in the conservatorship, according to internal Black Box documents. The surveillance was billed to Mrs. Spears' estate. Mr. Harder said it was inappropriate to bill for the legal and security services because Mrs. Taylor incurred them only as a result of her work for the estate. In November of 2020, TriStar stepped down as the estate's business manager amid growing calls to investigate the firm. Mr. Harder said that TriStar resigned after its staff received threats. The Times contacted roughly 200 people who worked at TriStar over the past decade. Mr. Harder sent 8 cease and desist letters to the Times demanding that reporters stop contacting employees and clients. One of Mr. Harder's colleagues emailed former TriStar employees warning of legal repercussions if they spoke with the Times. Many employees told the Times they wouldn't talk because they were scared of being sued. On a recent Sunday morning, Mrs. Taylor arrived at the newly remodeled called Calvary Chapel, Brentwood. About 60 people showed up for the service. A Christian rock band preceded Mr. Taylor's sermon. Dressed casually in sunglasses, slacks, and an oversized plaid shirt, Lou Taylor swayed to the music. She held her left hand aloft, displaying a ring with love spelled in tiny diamonds. About 3 weeks later, the California judge ended the conservatorship. Mr. Rosengart is still trying to determine how much money TriStar made through Britney Spears. And Britney Spears went on to write in a now-deleted Instagram post, "I'm embarrassed for the state of California for permitting my father to have me work as hard as he worked me all those years and never seeing a dime. I'm embarrassed for all of them, and I'm sad for them because I know my value and worth now."